We're back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at The Federalist. As always, you can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. Make sure to subscribe wherever you download your podcasts as well. Today, I'm so happy to be joined by Independent Women's Forum senior policy analyst Inez Stepman, also a senior contributor at The Federalist. Inez, welcome and welcome back to the District of Columbia.
It's wonderful to be here, and it's wonderful to be here in person as opposed to on Zoom.
So. Right, and it's a beautiful spring day, which reminds me of another beautiful spring day, actually, that I spent at an Independent Women's Forum event just a few years ago, which is still the highlight of my professional career. IWF arranged for me to interview the subject of this discussion at the time, a few years ago, and that would be none other than Camille Paglia herself. Helen Andrews, a brilliant writer, one of our favorite writers, has a chapter dedicated to Camille Paglia, arguing that she is an avatar of boomer failures in her most recent book, which I believe is just called Boomers. A lot of interesting stuff in the book.
It does have some fantastic cover art that very, I think,
yes,
it captures sort of the boomer hippie aesthetic. That's fantastic.
That's a good way to say it.
Yeah.
And so Helen argues that Camille Paglia is best, I guess, interpreted as an avatar or a mascot of boomer failures. But Camille Paglia is someone who, aside from being a brilliant and energetic writer of prose, she has some of the best writing that's published. I mean, her columns for The Hollywood Reporter, whenever they come out, or the columns she used to do with Salon, right? Or the Q&As she used to do with Salon. I mean, it's just incredible. When you're talking to Camille Paglia in person, it's just the only, I guess, phrase that fits her is tour de force. She is amazing. Conservatives have seen her as an ally since she started critiquing contemporary feminism, really back in the early 1990s, maybe the late 1980s even. But should conservatives have this admiration for Camille Paglia? Is she somebody who actually, at the end of the day, moves the ball forward from the conservative perspective? Or is the conservative admiration for Paglia perhaps misplaced? I think Inez and I come down on the same side of this argument. I think we're both pro Paglia, but it's also worth reconsidering the conservative love for Camille Paglia in light of Helen's argument in Boomers. So Inez, just let me kick it to you. Is it misplaced? Is our love misplaced?
I think it would be misplaced to describe her as a conservative. I think that's right. But I do think that she agrees with conservatives on one very fundamental aspect of sort of her premise that underlies is far precedes politics. And that's on human nature, on the nature of sexuality, on the nature of nature itself. And here's where I do think that some of Helen's critiques are a little misplaced. She seems to think that Paglia never would have predicted or failed to see, or even willfully failed to see some of the disastrous results of the release of sort of sexual liberation through the cultural and sexual revolution in America in the 1960s, that she wouldn't have predicted it, didn't predict it, and then failed to criticize it when it happened. I don't think it's a fair critique of Camille Paglia, especially to say that she doesn't address enough the destructiveness of nature and of natural sexuality. I think, in fact, she screams that from the top of her lungs in all of her work. It's a major theme of her work. I think the primary difference is exactly her attitude towards it. She champions civilization as necessary, and to some extent, repression of sexuality as necessary. But it's obvious that she finds it fascinating, right? She finds sort of pagan sexuality fascinating and exciting. And obviously, I think conservatives find it more repellent and terrifying. But I think that's largely a matter of personality, of other aspects of ideology. But I think that critique in particular is just unfair. She would not have foreseen the destructiveness of unleashed sexuality is, at least in my interpretation, flies in against the heart of her work.
She has this, I guess, probably famous. I don't know how, I can't tell like how deep into the Paglia rabbit hole that I am, but have you read her journey into strip clubs? Have you ever read this particular piece of writing? Okay, I think it was for Hustler in the mid-90s. And yes, of course, like that that would be something that supports Helen's argument, because Paglia sees these strippers of the mid-90s as, again, I'll use the word that is used commonly in her book, all the time in her books, pagan. She sees this as sort of like, there's this pagan ritualism that you see when you go into a strip club. This is womanhood. I mean, her most important essay, as far as I'm concerned, is the opening chapter of her thesis, Sexual Personae, which is published by Yale. And she talks about the Venus of Willendorf right off the bat. Have you read that?
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting?
So yeah, and right off the bat, the thesis is that civilization is the Apollonian sort of construct built to forget nature, to freeze nature, that nature is not beautiful but ugly. And then the contrast between the Dionysian, or I think she uses a different word as well, just because she says that Dionysian has that kind of crude connotation, but that's not the sense in which she means it. The uncontrollable, the and exactly the taboo and the violent. She says that rape is a natural part of human sexuality as well as animal sexuality. These are all things that get her in trouble with feminists, but they are fundamentally true, and I do think they're fundamentally in line with how conservatives think about human nature, about sexuality. I think the major difference is simply she revels in it in a certain sense, right? She understands the consequences, and she understands that it's necessary for civilization to push back against it, to freeze it, to like all the great achievements of Western civilization depend on essentially, escaping from the consequences of nature. But she understands that we can also never fully conquer it. And I think that's why she, for example, supports legalized prostitution, legalized pornography.
I actually support legalized prostitution. She's, again, also an admirer of certain kinds of pornography. Not all kinds of... She's a critic, actually, of what you could arguably describe as pornography on Instagram.
Right. I think she believes in having some outlets for... most particularly, I would be amiss to say, but most particularly art, right? Some outlets for this kind of raw human sexuality that isn't conquerable by societal norm, but nevertheless, she recognizes that we have to build a civilization and societal norms to somehow contain it, and at least to some degree. In fact, she says at one point, I think, if we didn't repress things, we would go insane, right? And I find this to be much more in keeping with actually observing how men and women, for example, interact, either as opposite sex or same sex. I find this to be much, much more true and in observation than a lot of the feminist canon, right? But even I think to some extent, and maybe here I'm going to out myself as not as conservative or as some folks at the Federalist, but I think she has something to offer conservatives as readers, as a rebuke to nostalgia, right? I think conservatives spend so much time thinking about, and maybe she would call it Apollonian, freezing time, and this kind of construct of perhaps, let's say 1953, the 1950s, of the relations between the sexes, when in reality, first of all, the 1950s were a very particular moment in time where women, where technological progress and the enormous wealth of capitalism had essentially freed women from what had been separate labor from men, but nevertheless had been dawn to dusk labor. And by the way, complete control for the most part in Western civilizations over the private sphere. And so the 1950s were this odd moment in time where wealth had caught up, but women did not leave in large numbers to work outside of the home, right? Except until the war, where the 50s and Betty Friedan and all this problem with No Name and all this stuff were essentially women who had jobs outside the home during the war and then went back to sort of domestic suburban life that was idealized, and I think perhaps is too nostalgized, if that's a word, by conservatives today. I don't think the reality of sex differences means that we need to try to strive to return that cult of domesticity from the 50s. Indeed, I think that that's actually probably quite destructive in terms of actually being productive and how to think about restoring some biological truths about men and women to the modern context. And I do think it's overly nostalgic. And I think that conservatives should read exactly somebody like Halia on those issues is a rebuke to nostalgia, right? To remember that the divisions between men and women are go back, millennia, and go back to, the dawn of time, and some of the tensions, the productive tensions between men and women, are incredibly valuable. But we need to find a way to express it anew in each era. We cannot go back and backwards wrangle the notion of the 50s and into modern life. I think that's actually one, it won't go anywhere because simply people aren't interested in it, beyond a very small percentage of conservatives. And two, it's just counterproductive because some of the norms of the 50s, as applied to the way that young women are raised today and how young men are raised today, I think are actually counterproductive. So, different time. We need to think about how to apply these eternal sex differences, eternal truths to a different time rather than, Anyway, I'm repeating myself, but conservatives have a tendency to nostalgia. I have a tendency to nostalgia, and I find reading Polya very, very helpful in pushing back against that sort of conservative instinct to nostalgia.
Well, it's interesting. The pendulum has swung so far towards the left now that even Polya has a sort of penchant for nostalgia because she's very nostalgic for the golden age of Hollywood, which she sees as something that is completely a bygone era at this point. I briefly alluded to her comments on Instagram and sort of the way that we are as sexed out as ever and yet utterly sexless. That we have this culture where there's this culture of sex positivity, but it's so utterly unsexy, right? It's so unsexy. And I think also that is a good counterpoint to Helen's argument that Polya actually has this, and you can read this in Sexual Persona, which is I think the most critical text to read to understand Polya, where she talks about the differences in biological sex, and that's something I guess you could call nostalgic at this point as well. But the ways that women can have to borrow a phrase, feminine mystique, but the mystique of femininity and the mystique of womanhood. Polya really is a champion of sex differences and sex differences in the way that they can create the mystery or that they can foster the mystery of femininity that is so essential to procreation, that is so essential to human life and human culture. And I think, again, this gets to this notion that there is a distinction to be drawn. I think you're absolutely right that regardless of whether conservatives should champion Polya, they should read Polya because the writing is brilliant, but also there are good sort of counterpoints that can counterbalance things like conservative nostalgia. At the same time, though, then, should conservatives be championing a woman who champions strip clubs and is, anti-porn regulation, et cetera, et cetera? I understand why people raise that question. I understand that completely. But what do you say to that in light of how right and how I think eloquent and articulate and well argued her defense of biological essentialism is?
It's not just a defense of biological essentialism. It's a defense of female sexuality,
yep.
And female sexual power. And actually, I think there's no better moment than now, even though, of course, she railed against her own political correctness in the 1990s and into the 2000s. But there's no better moment than now to revive this critique of the idea of women as somehow hapless victims and totally not in control of any kind of sexual power. And of course, Polly would love to reference film right here. The idea that somebody like Katharine Hepburn or even Bette Davis had no control over her relationships with men, that she was a victim. And I think this is rightly offensive. It should be offensive. Obviously, it's offensive to Polly, but it should be offensive to conservatives as well. And it should be offensive to women. It's actually very liberating to understand the power that women have, or that we have as women, in these kinds of situations where I think the current feminist left would want to impose these top-down, rigid, sort of legalistic structures around human interaction that are, one, doomed to fail always, because you cannot come into something as complex as human interaction as complex as something like flirting would be, and come at it from this sort of legalistic doctrinaire, ball busting perspective that so many on the feminist left seem to have, and then had, even going back, the same, people that Polya picked fights with, right? Andrea Dworkin, for example.
Yes.
That ethos seems to be coming back. It at the time, it seems to like sort of recede and grow, but right now I think it has an enormous amount of power on college campuses. It is the genesis of a incredibly tyrannical kangaroo court system that was implemented under the Obama administration through reinterpretation of Title IX, reversed by the Trump administration, and now attempted, once again, Joe Biden administration has signaled their intent to reverse it, to reverse the due process protections that have been placed into the regulations, right? So by the Trump administration. But that is the rebuke, right? And that's well worth reading. Doesn't matter what you think about her other views. But in terms of the things that would be considered anti-conservative, I don't know what to call them because I don't want to quite call them liberal, but anti-conservative in her writing, I don't think, again, maybe this is where I differ with Helen, I don't think that her championing of things like strip clubs is a reflection of a lack of understanding about what untrammeled human sexuality is capable of. I think it's rather a reflection of her wanting to actually sort of push those things into the realm of great art, which and then like sort of outlets that are, I think, and I don't know, you actually are the Polya expert here between the two of us, but I would guess that Camille Paglia, for example, would not be a fan of strip clubs like on for example, the performance that you and I discussed, the Cardi B strip club performance. Yes. I actually can see her making an argument against that, exactly because she thinks that there need to be some things that exist but are repressed, some things that are perhaps taboo, but in fact retain their eroticism because they are taboo. I don't think she's opposed to this idea of relegating certain types of eroticism that exist and have always existed to particular corners of society, rather than putting them front and center. And to return to the very relevant point that you made in the question, that's what's happened now, right? The problem is it's out in front and center. There are no more taboos. It's boring. And that's what happened with the Cardi B performance, right? There is no genuine eroticism in that performance because we've seen it 10,000 times before, and it's endorsed by the whole of society, and everybody claps like seals for it. It's lost any of its actual transgressive nature. There's no element of loss of innocence or something actually exciting going on. And I don't know. I think that conservatives and Polya, to some degree, could come to a negotiated compromise over, exactly how far into the mainstream should we allow these things that we all know exist. We're not puritanical. We're not cognizant that they exist, but conservatives maybe draw the line a little further in terms of what should be legal, mainstream, and certainly what children should be exposed to. But I think this is a question that you can actually negotiate in good faith and have good conversations with somebody who actually agrees on the underlying nature of sexuality, I think largely with conservatives, whereas today's feminists do not. They believe that they can endlessly, they can make sexuality and human nature endlessly malleable, and that they can sort of twist it completely by social convention, that there's no underlying biological reality to push back against those social convention, that everything is socially constructed. I don't know that there is a productive conversation to be had with someone who believes that men and women are identical as a matter of biology.
Yeah. I've watched people try to have those conversations. It doesn't end well. I remember actually when I worked for Christina Hoff Sommers, AEI hosted, the American Enterprise Institute hosted a debate between Christina and, I actually think she was a doctor, a biologist or neuroscientist or whatever, who tried to make that argument that biological distinctions were negligible, basically. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But I think it's to key in on something that you just mentioned. It's not even so. Let's take this Cardi B Megan Thee Stallion performance at the Grammys, which was, it not only is it no longer taboo, but their sexuality itself was not pagan in the sense that Camille Paglia would really
it was robotic. She said the same thing about Lady Gaga, by the way.
She hates Lady Gaga because she loves
death of
Madonna.
sex. Yeah.
Yes, the death of sex.
That it's robotic and artificially sort of strained, that it doesn't actually connect with the erotic in any way, even though she's a beautiful woman, in various levels of undress, that she has managed to make that unsexy, which I think is like, it's the tragedy of our era, right? Like especially folks like you and I know you're a few years younger, but essentially the same generation. The power that women had in terms of dealing with these kinds of situations, both attracting the attention of men and dealing with, let's say, men who are not predators, but to use the words of my friend Madeline Kearns, not predators, but pigs. The ability to deftly deal with these kinds of sexual advances is both the stuff of comedy, it's the stuff of feminine empowerment, right? There's no way to eviscerate better a man than to laugh at his sexual advances, right? Like, this is something that women will never, this is a tragedy women will never experience, right? The like feeling of being gutted by a woman that you pursued, laughing at your advances, right? Our modern culture strips women of all of that power. And I think Paglia rightly sees that as a tragedy, just as she sees it as a tragedy that a woman as beautiful as Lady Gaga can strip naked on stage and like not a single, man in the audience. I'm exaggerating. It's not, I'm sure there are men.
Well, men have been programmed sort of away from their own nature by this culture of pornography and excess sexuality that she's decried. And, it's another kind of interesting aspect of this entire conversation. I mean, there's so many different places. There's so many different threads to pick at here, but it's hard to see somebody who is at their foundation, who shares the foundational values of biology, which maybe we have taken for granted in the past, of biology and sexuality for granted, or as an enemy to conservatism or as a failure of the sexual revolution. And I think that's a really unfair sort of position to cast her in, because if anything, the consequences of the sexual revolution are performances like Megan Thee Stallion and Cardi B. And I don't think you can find anything in Camille Paglia's writing that would be an argument in favor of a performance like that. In fact, if you read her Hustler, I think it was, dive into strip clubs or tour of, I think it was like New York strip clubs, you would see that she would, it's actually an argument against what they did. And so I think to cast her as an avatar of failed boomerism and an avatar of the failed excessive sexual revolution is it's sort of out of step with the version of sexuality that she champions, which probably does make a lot of conservatives uncomfortable because she is fully pro-gay. She calls herself transgender, identifies as transgender, but not totally in the contemporary sense. And so, yes, she's cultural leftist in a lot of the sort of ways that sexual revolutionaries of her era absolutely were. But at the same time, she's fundamentally different from most of them and is fundamentally different from the excesses that have evolved from the sexual revolution. And I don't think she can actually be blamed for stoking those excesses, because as soon as she started to notice it, she pushed back on it vehemently right away in the 1990s.
So I would make 2 points. One, she obviously has a much longer historical basis. I mean, she tracks sexuality. Her work tracks sexuality and personae, going back, to ancient Egypt, right? To pigeonhole her into the 1960s. Now, there are aspects of the 60s she absolutely loves, right?
Oh, yeah.
Especially, some of the rock music and some of the aspects of sexual liberation of the 1960s. She absolutely endorses and loves. But I think the fundamental difference, what I see as like boomerism, or the most fundamental aspect of what survived from the sexual revolution and from boomerism, and what I think conservatives rightly critique, I think you and I rightly critique, is the trivialization of sex.
Yep.
And I think that is one thing you cannot ever accuse Camille Paglia of, if anything, she's dedicated her whole life to studying the incredible power of sex. And I just don't see how that is an avatar boomerism. I think the much more appropriate avatar boomerism would be somebody who thinks they can play with sexual fire and not get burned. And I'm sure we can come up with a lot of, Alyssa Milano might be more in line, even though I don't think she's a boomer, she's too young to be, but she's more, you never accuse a Hollywood actress of being older than she is. This is but Alyssa Milano to me represents much more of a boomer sexual ethos than Camille Paglia, in the sense that she champions basically the idea that men and women will always will be essentially interchangeable, and that in fact when there are destructive clashes of the sexual nature between men and women, that men are always at fault. This is the antithesis of what I think Paglia has written about, and especially the things that keep, I guess, I wonder if she's ever upset about the fact that the date rape stuff, her date rape column keeps getting brought up in all kinds of contexts. But I thought the column itself was great.
You would.
I would. But you can't read that column and not come away with an understanding of her thought as recognizing the danger of liberation. In fact, she's exhorting women to rise to the level of personal responsibility necessary in admiring and participating in what's essentially a man's world. And I don't see how you can turn that into sort of a cheap trivialization of sex in any way.
2 points off of that. First of all, this makes a broader, I guess, point about the sexual revolution. Do you think there was a naivete among people who championed, introduced, and proliferated things like birth control, or even the entire sort of 60s concept of women's liberation? Or do you actually think that this really stemmed from, I don't want to say Marxists, but postmodernists that actually did genuinely want to trample and shatter sexual norms and cultural norms kind of in general? So I guess what I'm trying to get at here is, do you think that this is the end result of the sexual revolution was the fault of people who were overly naive, or is it the fault of people who were not naive at all and actually are accomplishing exactly what they wanted to, which is kind of Marxist destruction? Maybe I hate the term cultural Marxist, but as people understand the term cultural Marxist, a cultural Marxist destruction of the nuclear family.
I mean, in terms of the 1960s, I think it was mostly naivete.
Yeah, I agree.
Right, stemming from a Rousseauian conception of nature, of human nature, and of men and women. There's no doubt that there are some people, primarily in academia, who wanted to facilitate the destruction of the family. But I think it was fundamental naivete. It's very natural for people to wish away the constraints of nature. And in fact, some of our greatest our greatest achievements as a civilization are done, again, in true Paulian understanding, as in contradiction and in opposition to nature, right? Techne, right? We build civilization. We build, not only tall buildings, but the edifices of civilization and how we interact with each other, exactly to cover up the ugliness of nature underneath, and to live our lives not wholly in the grip and power, to imagine that we are not in the grip and power of nature that can be destroyed at any given moment by nature, by our own bodies, by that's the essence there, I think.
So is Paglia, is she part of the naive coalition?
No, I don't think that's why I don't think she represents boomerism. Mm-hmm. I think there was this naive moment where we thought we will really conquer nature, right?
Yes. We still think that, by the way. There's a new pill to combat obesity. I read about this. I don't know how legitimate it is, but they're in development of a new pill to conquer hunger, which, is just merely nature's way of keeping us alive. We will conquer nature.
Yeah, I think that is why I fundamentally I would put Paglia on the right side of the spectrum, even though I know and that spectrum is not particularly helpful here anyway, but in my definitions of conservative versus the left, right, I think I make that fundamental division. If you recognize that human nature, there are aspects of human nature that are fixed and uncontrollable, that in fact nature itself is not controllable wholly by human means, and that the best thing civilization can do is to build, these edifices around it to sort of protect us from the buffeting of nature in our everyday lives, to allow us to forget and enjoy the feeling of dominion over nature, and in a very real concrete sense, to live fundamentally different and better lives than people did, 200 years ago, 500 years ago, a millennia ago, because we can escape the ravages of day-to-day death, for example. The sheer number of children who died before the age of 5, before the modern medical era, is astonishing. I think it's a wonderful thing that we've advanced out of that, but it allows us this hubris, right? It allows us this hubris to imagine that we can escape nature altogether or conquer it altogether. It both drives us to incredible feats of civilization, this imagination that we can escape nature, but also is complete folly, especially when applied to sexual relations, and especially when applied to politics. I think that's why our founders were incredibly wise to try to set up a system that allowed for human nature, that actually tried as best it could to balance, various negative aspects of human nature, and to set them against each other, and to balance power. Like, these are incredibly positive and wise constructs that come out of this fundamental understanding of nature as not just this, lovely thing, like not like goop, right? Not always good for you. Nature made hemlock too, and even hemlock is one of the prettier things that nature has constructed, right? So I don't know, that is why I'll put her on the conservative side, even though, again, that spectrum is a little bit
conservative by the standards today, which again deny human nature. Like, the left denies human nature, thus conservative on this weird spectrum binary formulation that we put it into. It's like now conservative to embrace human nature and to disagree with these new cultural leftist concepts. And so in that sense, she's certainly on the conservative side.
Wait, I'm sorry. Before I lose track of what, yes. The definition of a liberal is somebody who thinks that children are pure. That is my definition of a liberal.
Also cats.
I know, I'm just saying, like, children need to be civilized. Like, children are us.
So we're back to being civilized. We're back to Rousseau.
Right. To me, that's and if that's the definition, Polya is a conservative.
Well, so we haven't even talked yet about a nut that I've always had a hard time cracking. Is Polya is a fan of Simone de Beauvoir. Something that actually does present, I think, problems for conservative admirers of Polya is that she's very Freudian, although I think her sort of Freudian description of genitals, male and female genitals, and sexual persona is brilliant, and absolutely must-read material that frames sex differences in a fascinating way. But it brings us kind of back to this question, is she a net benefit or a net loss for the conservative cause? And I'm sorry to continue framing this like we're on Sports Center, but it's just to continue kind of getting to the heart of it. Are we only admirers for Camille Paglia because we exist in this postmodern society where a lot of these fundamental truths that people shouldn't have a hard time championing, or shouldn't have a hard time agreeing with, like nature and biological essentialism? Are we only interested in her, or do we only admire her in this very postmodern context in which so much logic and instinct has been stripped away from the conversation? Or outside of that context, does her work still hold up? Again, I know where I come down in this, and I'm suspecting you come down on the same side as well.
That's always the problem when we do these things, because you and I agree on like almost everything, so we're going to have to find something that we disagree on and have a fight.
Someday. Goop. Clearly you don't like Goop. I'm a big champion of Queen Gleneth.
No, I can imagine a circumstance in which, like, I would be in opposition to Camille Paglia on any number of social issues. So to that extent, yes, I think the fact that we've gone so far in denial of biological truths makes us natural allies in a way that perhaps we would not be in a different society that didn't have such quite extreme denial. But actually, I'm glad you brought up Simone de Beauvoir, because that was something I hadn't read Sexual Personae since college, so I went back and sort of in preparation for this and read.
What college did you go to where they assigned that?
Oh, they didn't assign it.
Oh, I was like,
yeah. No. I also took extremely esoteric philosophy courses in an attempt to avoid race, class, and gender, because that was the three things that every stupid philosophy course was arrayed around, which of course are incredibly interesting concepts, but not the way they're being taught. Right?
I took a class called Philosophy of Race and Gender.
Yeah, see, I stayed away from those. I literally took Philosophy of Color to avoid that.
Wow, that actually sounds interesting. But the class started with the professor, who I think was also a part-time yoga instructor, walking to the chalkboard and writing, "Race is a social construct" on the chalkboard. So that's how my education went.
Well, I certainly did not have a world-class education, and I am jealous every day of the people who did have one. But in going back, one of her, she does like praise Simone de Beauvoir a lot, and I think if there is a critique of Camille Paglia and her work, I would think it has very little to do with sort of this liberal conservative divide, and perhaps a similar critique as I might level at Woody Allen, somebody who I also admire, enjoy some of his movies, is that
Inez is about to defend Harvey Weinstein.
Is that she's a brilliant and eclectic person with very particularized interests, and there's clearly like a set of people who fascinate her. And then I think she kind of goes back and draws all these lines, and because she's brilliant, she draws them like in a very convincing way. But I also think there's a certain amount of her work that's driven by her just mere sort of eclecticism. Is that a word? No. Her eclectic personality and like falling in love, especially with certain figures, especially figures of female assertion, right? So think Katharine Hepburn or Amelia Earhart, who she also cites a lot. And trying to sort of draw maybe some parallels that are actually more difficult for the ordinary woman, or the average woman, I should say, rather than ordinary. That would be more of my critique, is that I think part of her embrace of Simone de Beauvoir is because Simone de Beauvoir was such a fascinating character, assertive, brilliant, right? Excellent writer, able to hold attention of intellectuals around her. And I can see why that would be attractive to Paglia, but I ultimately think the construction myth, the social construction myth, does trace to Simone de Beauvoir, who, after all, said one is not born but made woman. And
the proliferation of it, the popularization of it,
right? The popularization of it. I mean, and it goes back long before her, actually, all the way to the earliest American feminists and during the founding as well. This idea of how much of the differences between men and women are socially constructed, how much of, or what percentage of them are natural and due to biology. This sort of nature versus nurture debate, I would say that it is at least arguable from someone who did not go through gender studies and therefore read every single academic feminist available, but simply read these two books, right? Sexual Personae and The Second Sex. I think The Second Sex is pretty constructivist. Like it does endorse this idea of femininity as constructed, not just as performed, as Paglia, I think, would agree, but as in a more fundamental way, being a product of society rather than of biology. And so I would be curious to know, I'm sure she thought about it, but why Paglia endorses so strongly the work of Simone de Beauvoir, other than that she was brilliant and fascinating, because that's the little, that's the thing in the back of my mind, the dullard conservative response I have, which is this: she just finds her fascinating and therefore wants to see in her something that aligns with her own, interests.
Well, we can close on sort of Paglia's recent pop culture takes, or semi-recent pop culture takes, because I think that is a good. It's a rich area. There's fertile ground here, but I can understand from the perspective of conservatives and people who I've had this debate with about Paglia being a champion of, let's say, Madonna. and a high profile champion of Madonna at the time, that Madonna was extremely controversial. And this is in another era, right before Tipper Gore came on the scene and was, even from the left, and joined by a lot of conservatives in trying to police art and speech through the hand of the government in various ways. But if you look at her championing of Madonna, if you look at her championing of, let's say, the Real Housewives, and I know Inez is not a Real Housewives.
I have not seen the Real Housewives.
I'm obviously a Real Housewives obsessive, and I find Polia's analyses of the Real Housewives fascinating because she does it through this biological lens. She says these are what soap operas no longer can be. This is you see all of the mystique and sort of aspirational biological womanhood come to life in the dynamics on The Real Housewives. And that sort of changed since she wrote that original essay. But again, I can see from the conservative perspective how you might say that's corrosive. You are creating, or you are arguing in favor of and championing and normalizing people who set terrible examples for young women, who lower the bar for our conduct, who do, let's even take from Helen Andrews' perspective, the sexual revolution didn't beget Real Housewives. I can understand why people would ask those questions. My first caveat would be, I don't think Camille Paglia would ever argue for normalizing Madonna. It's sort of like this entire argument about drag. Drag in and of itself is one thing, and it used to happen in this sort of enigmatic subculture. And now the left is trying to normalize it. Instead of sort of trying to enjoy the mystique of the subculture, they're trying to normalize drag. And I would say I would apply that same argument to a lot of the sexual taboos that Paglia admires or writes glowingly about. She's not necessarily trying to normalize it. She's trying to say that, there's kind of an ecosphere, a sexual ecosphere in which some of this is exciting and mysterious and natural. What's your response to that?
Well, I think you're right. And if my memory serves me, in the famous defense she wrote of Madonna in the New York Times.
I think it was in the New York Times, yeah.
Back when the Times published interesting things.
Imagine them publishing Camille Paglia now.
I think she actually, it's in defense of one of Madonna's music videos that portrays her as a dominatrix and various other sexual imagery. And she loves it, loves the music video, calls it, I think, something along the lines of glorious pornography. But nevertheless, her review starts out with, because the reason it was being written about is because it was being banned on MTV. Her review starts out, MTV was correct to ban it. They were right to ban it. And I don't think that wouldn't be, not to misquote her or anything. She wasn't saying it should be banned by law, but she was saying that being broadcast in prime time with young children as viewers, that they were right to pull it off of that environment. And I think this goes very much to the point you made about counterculture, that counterculture and eroticism both, and sometimes together, sometimes not, right? There are many kinds of countercultures, not all of them erotic. For them to exist and actually retain a lot of their allure, they need a culture to push against.
Yes.
And they need something to be transgressive about. And I think nothing better illustrates this than the evolution of, I think it's called the Searchlight nightclub, Spotlight Searchlight nightclub. Now it's a Lime Gym. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself to the end of the story, but the point is, there is an old church in Manhattan that was turned into a spectacularly popular nightclub in the 80s and 90s. It was both like a hotspot for gay night clubbing and for straight night clubbing, I think. And that's an obvious, like, this is something that I'm sure conservatives, there's certain kinds of conservatives who would be aghast by this, right? There's this transgressive act of turning a former church into this nightclub, right? But I see in turning it into a nightclub actually a much more, in some ways, healthy and vibrant both culture and counterculture and interplay between the two than we have today. So fast forward to today, and that place is a gym, right? there's nothing more to transgress about when you can put a gym in a church, right? The reason they put the nightclub there is because there was something to transgress against. It was exciting to do so, exactly because some things were still held sacred in the culture, and therefore to transgress against that was something innovative, exciting, artistic, even, right? And many, there, of course, there are good transgressions and bad, right? There are transgressions that are just incredibly destructive, and there are transgressions. It depends what you're transgressing against, right, and whether it's good or bad. So I'm not trying to make even the moral argument here. I'm merely saying that it's a reflection of a healthier culture, that it's a nightclub being put in the church rather than the gym, because the gym signifies that there is nothing sacred left about the church to transgress against, that in fact, it's just the same as any other ordinary building. And I actually think that's a more depressing and more problematic and dangerous state of affairs than the state of affairs that has a strong culture and then endures transgressions from various, often artistic subcultures that can produce something that Polya would like, great art through that tension, but can also provide a home for people who simply don't fit into the dominant paradigms, or a home for eroticisms that don't fit into the dominant paradigms. Now we have the situation where everybody's weirdness, particularly sexual weirdness, has to be into the mainstream, has to be broadcast to ever younger viewers, has to be endorsed and indeed applauded and normalized by the entire society. And that's not only destructive to society, it's also destructive to any kind of genuine eroticism or art, in my opinion.
I think we actually just landed on the key point here, which is that Polya has never supported the normalization of the sexual revolutions. Let me back up a little. Polya has never supported the normalization of sexually transgressive behavior. She has supported its existence and the, I guess, enjoyment of it in a way that I think conservatives can disagree on that point. But she has always placed it in a niche, right? Like, she has never supported the normalization of it. And I don't think you can argue that anything she has done or written has contributed to the excesses of the sexual revolution, has supported the excesses of the sexual revolution, because your point about that Madonna op-ed is spot on. She's always placed it as a subculture and as a niche, and if as a niche, I guess
a part of perhaps maybe not every person, but many people, many more than actually acted out, but as a necessary part of imagination as opposed to action, right? As in,
absolutely,
that accepting that there are things that must be relegated. And in fact, I think she actually reversed herself on her endorsement of NAMBLA, for example, which is probably the most controversial thing that she's ever done.
Also in Madonna recently.
Yeah, so she has reversed herself, at least on the NAMBLA stuff. She said basically some things, I've realized that some things must be confined to the realm of art and imagination rather than acted out because they are simply too destructive in real life. So I don't think that I agree with you completely. I don't think that she is in favor of normalization of many of the things that conservatives find, appalling about today's culture. And I think maybe the difference between her and typical conservative would be she's at least as worried about the destructive nature of normalizing these things on the things themselves, i.e. she's at least as concerned about the destruction of eroticism by pushing all of this into the mainstream where it becomes bland and sort of, it has a certain yawn factor. She's at least as concerned in that direction as conservatives are concerned about its negative impact on society as a whole.
Perfectly said. And we can just wrap up exactly on that point, which is, you said earlier that Polya is at the heart of her work a champion of nature, and she shares that with conservatives who do not try to deny human nature. Conservatives do not directionally try to deny human nature. They believe that a republic, as we have for now, should sort of regulate those and manage the tension between freedom and human nature. Absolutely. And I would say she's in the same place. And regardless of this postmodern context or not, that's a huge common ground that I think makes her well worth our respect, certainly worth our time. I can't recommend her. Her essay collection, Free Women, Free Men, is spectacular. It's a great place to start with Polya. But all of her work is, I think, really, really worth our time. But I think also in that sense, in that she is at her core a naturalist, and somebody who acknowledges and describes trenchantly and often beautifully human nature and applies that lens to current events and popular culture. I think she's absolutely indispensable and has been has moved the ball forward for a cause that conservatives also are working to advance.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think she has been indispensable, especially, and this is a bit of a cheapening, because I think we've spent the last hour talking about the substantive ways in which Polia's thought has, I think, been constructive for conservatives to read, or even where she differs with them. But I will say, some of her eviscerations of the sort of sanctimonious wing of the feminist left are just, it's worth it alone,
Dworkin.
right? It's just enjoyable, to read. So
it's beautiful,
especially since that wing of feminism is so dominant today, seems to govern so much of our sexual relations, and it's just a fun read. So you got to recommend it from that perspective too.
Well, Inez Stepman of the Independent Women's Forum, senior policy analyst, also a senior contributor at The Federalist. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me.
You're listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at The Federalist. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.